5th of November, 1997. Virgin Atlantic Flight 24 was just minutes from landing in London. Some busy passengers checked the time to get themselves ready, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. But suddenly the pilots realized the left landing gear of the plane got jammed. Without it properly functioning, it's impossible to land. Over 100 lives, no simulator training, almost no fuel left. Their only option was to attempt that impossible landing. The Airbus A340 was never designed to survive. And what happened next stunned the aviation world. It was a busy evening of November 5th, 1997, at Los Angeles International Airport. At 7:30 in that evening, 3 pilots walked into Los Angeles International Airport, ready for what they thought would be just another overnight flight across the world. 98 passengers were also arriving, checking their bags and settling in for the long journey ahead. None of them had any idea that by the next afternoon, they would all be making headlines around the globe. The plane they would be flying was a 4-year-old Airbus A340-300. It's a massive 4-engine aircraft, which was one of the most advanced and safest aircrafts in the sky. That day, this plane, operating as Flight 24, was scheduled to fly through the night, crossing the entire North American continent and then the Atlantic Ocean before landing in London the next afternoon. The journey would take about 10.5 hours. In the cockpit sat 3 experienced pilots, and Captain Tim Barnby, 40 years old, was in charge. He had flown for more than 14,000 hours. That's like flying non-stop for almost 2 years. Nearly 3,000 of those hours were specifically on this type of aircraft, the Airbus A340. And sitting next to him was 32-year-old First Officer Andrew Morley. While he was new to the A340 with only 301 hours on this particular plane, he had over 4,500 hours flying other aircraft. Behind them sat the relief pilot, 28-year-old First Officer Craig Mayton. His job was to take turns with the other pilots during the long flight so they could rest. As 13 cabin crew members helped passengers get comfortable, ground workers loaded 73 metric tons of fuel, enough to power 4 massive jet engines for the entire journey. Just at 9:09 at night local time, after 19 minutes of delay, the aircraft was pushed back from the gate. And the pilots started all 4 engines, and the plane began moving toward the runway 24 left. But what happened next would set in motion a chain of events that nobody could have predicted. First Officer Morley was flying the plane that night while Captain Barnby handled the radio calls and paperwork. Everything seemed perfectly normal as they lined up on the runway. The first officer pushed the throttles forward, and within moments the massive aircraft lifted off the ground. Captain Barnby then did something he had done thousands of times before. He raised the landing gear. It's a routine task after a successful takeoff, but as the left main landing gear folded up into its hiding place, something went a bit fishy. The movement of the landing gear seemed slower than usual, but nothing to be wary of. But something more happened there that pilots didn't notice. A small but crucial part called a torque pin came loose. This pin, which is no bigger than your finger, fell out of the plane just outside the airport. The pilots had no way of knowing this had happened, so they didn't flinch and kept flying casually. The plane turned northeast and began climbing over the Pacific Ocean. The passengers and pilots enjoyed the spectacular view of Los Angeles' sprawling lights below. Everything seemed perfect. The autopilot was engaged and Flight 24 was on its way to London, without knowing that that tiny missing piece would cause them life and death problems 10 hours later. The Airbus A340 is like a flying computer. It has sensors everywhere, constantly checking everything from engine temperature to wheel pressure, sending information to the plane's computer systems. Hours into the flight, as passengers settled in for sleep and the meal service was finishing, the pilots were doing their regular checks of all the plane's systems. That's when they noticed something odd. There is a sensor in every plane that monitors the temperature of the brakes. This is also the part that slows down the wheels when landing. In a normal flight, that part is supposed to show as numbers, but in this flight, that part was showing only 2 crosses. In airplane language, this means no signal. But in a plane with hundreds of sensors, one faulty reading usually isn't cause for panic. It's like when one light bulb burns out in your house. It's annoying, but not dangerous. The pilots noted it, but weren't overly concerned. They had no way of knowing that this seemingly minor warning was actually a clue to a much bigger problem in their landing gear. For the next several hours, the plane cruised peacefully eastward at 39,000 feet. Below them, the night slowly gave way to dawn as they crossed time zones. As they approached the Atlantic Ocean, the sunrise appeared on the horizon. Little did they realize how drastically this morning would change everything. Almost 10 hours after leaving Los Angeles, Flight 24 reached the London airspace. Around 3:04 in the afternoon local time, it began its descent toward London's Heathrow Airport. First Officer Morley was back at the controls after his rest period, with Captain Barnby beside him and Relief Pilot Mayton behind them. The weather in London was good. Some clouds, but great visibility and manageable winds. Air traffic control told them they would be landing on runway 27 left. In just a few minutes, they would be touching down. The first officer lined up with the runway. The flaps, movable parts on the wings that help slow the plane down, were set correctly. The speed was perfect. Everything was going according to plan. Now the final step was to lower the landing gear. But suddenly, 8 miles from the runway, when Captain Barnby moved the landing gear lever down, something terrifying happened. The right main landing gear dropped down and locked into place perfectly. The nose gear, which are the wheels at the front of the plane, also extended normally. But the left main landing gear didn't move, and the plane's computer immediately sent out warnings: gear unsafe. Following this warning, more alarms appeared on their screens. The pilots couldn't land like this. Even if they tried, the plane would tip over onto its left side without those wheels to support it. And the possible result? The aircraft could slide off the runway, break apart, or even crash into the terminal buildings where thousands of people were waiting for their flights. They thought, sometimes landing gear just needs extra time to extend. So the pilots continued their approach, hoping the problem would fix itself. But as they got closer to the ground, it became clear that the gear wasn't coming down at all. Finally, at 1,400 feet above the runway, First Officer Morley had to pull the plane back up into the sky. He was basically forced to choose go-round because of the problem. They would have to try again, but when they raised the gear to go around, they got another alarming message. The left landing gear hadn't locked back up into place either. This means it was stuck somewhere in the middle, neither up nor down. And for landing gear, this is probably the worst place to be. Running out of choices, Captain Barnby contacted air traffic control and explained their situation. The controllers directed them to fly to a point called Bovingdon, north of London, where they could fly in circles at 8,000 feet while they tried to fix the problem. This gave the pilots time to think, work through their emergency checklists, and try different solutions. First, they tried something called a gravity gear extension. This is like manually cranking down a car window when the electric motor brakes. They slowed the plane down to between 190 and 200 knots, which is about 220 to 230 miles per hour. Then they used a special handle that releases all hydraulic pressure. This should allow the gear to fall down and lock into place using just gravity. They waited and watched their instruments carefully. The right gear and nose gear lowered normally, but again, the left gear remained stuck. Whatever was wrong couldn't be fixed by their standard emergency procedures. Fortunately, they were flying near Heathrow, where Virgin Atlantic has its main operations center. This meant the pilots could talk directly by radio to maintenance engineers, the chief pilot, and the A340 fleet manager. They are the people who knew these aircraft better than almost anyone in the world. When contacted, the engineers suggested trying various electrical fixes, pulling and resetting circuit breakers. It's like flipping switches in your house's electrical panel when the power goes out. The pilots tried everything suggested, but nothing worked. They tried the old technique of raising the gear handle and lowering it again, followed by the gravity extension procedure. Still nothing. During this time, Flight 24 continued flying in circles above London while precious fuel burned away in their tanks. The reality was becoming clear. They might have to land this massive aircraft without one of its main sets of wheels. But this was something none of these pilots had ever practiced, not even in the flight simulator. Now they might have to do it for real with over 100 lives depending on them. Time was running out. The 4 engines of the A340 use fuel quickly, especially when flying in circles at lower altitude. As they checked, they had only 1 hour of fuel remaining. Captain Barnby had another suspicion in his mind. He wanted to be sure whether there really was a problem or if it was just faulty sensors giving false warnings. So he asked air traffic control for permission to do something very unusual at a busy airport like Heathrow, a low-level flyby of the control tower. This would allow people on the ground to look at the plane and tell him what they could see. The captain announced the plan to passengers and flight attendants, warning them not to be alarmed when they saw the airport terminal passing right outside their windows. Within minutes, he had lined up with the runway, but instead of landing, he would fly just above it. A Virgin Atlantic engineer had rushed to the control tower specifically to examine the landing gear as the plane passed overhead. With the massive A340 flying just 300 feet above the ground, barely higher than a 30-story building, Captain Barnby tilted the plane left and then right, giving those in the tower a clear view of the aircraft's belly. The engineer's report confirmed their worst fears. The left main landing gear was partially extended, hanging awkwardly from the plane like a broken leg. It ensured that this wasn't a sensor problem, it was real and it was serious. The captain climbed away from the airport, still hoping to find a solution. The airline's A340 fleet manager suggested something desperate and dangerous. Attempt another approach. But this time, instead of landing normally, he advised to touch down hard on just the right main gear, hoping the impact might shake the left gear loose. It sounds like a great plan on paper, but it was incredibly risky. They would have to hit the runway hard enough to jerk the stuck gear free, but not so hard that they damaged the only working main gear. Even worse, the plane could tip left and crash onto the failed gear, sending them skidding violently off the runway. Still, just as they were considering this dangerous maneuver, a crucial warning lit up in the cockpit: low fuel. The clock was now ticking against them. Even if the hard landing worked, they would still need fuel to circle back and attempt a proper landing. Fuel they simply didn't have. So quickly, they had to reach a final decision. But after 12 straight hours on duty, flying through the night, and now dealing with this emergency, the pilots were mentally exhausted. Still, Captain Barnby made the decision that would determine whether everyone on board lived or died. Their next approach would be their final one, and they would land at London Heathrow. On the ground, emergency vehicles rushed into position as Flight 24 prepared for what could be a destructive landing. Virgin Atlantic maintenance suggested one last desperate idea: use the force of gravity in a steep turn to try to pull the gear down. The captain was asked to tilt the A340 at up to 50 degrees. Captain Barnby agreed to try, and according to the plan, the massive airliner rolled over until it was closer to its side than to level flight. Passengers, unprepared for this extreme maneuver, were pressed into their seats with 1.5 times their normal weight. Nervous chatter filled the cabin as people wondered what was happening. In the cockpit, the pilots watched their instruments desperately, hoping to see the gear finally extend. But even this extreme measure wasn't enough. The left main gear remained stubbornly stuck. The reality was now undeniable. Flight 24 would have to land without its left main landing gear. It's simply going face-to-face with a dead or alive situation. At 10 minutes past 4 in the afternoon, the crew declared a mayday, the international distress signal that means lives are in immediate danger. Air traffic control immediately stopped all departures from Heathrow. Arriving flights were sent to holding patterns. The runways were cleared. Fire trucks and ambulances moved into position. On the ground, Heathrow Airport prepared for the worst. In the cockpit, more low fuel warnings appeared on their screens. The pilots had no choice now. They had to land, and they had to do it soon. But one more concern remained: the weather. During all these maneuvers, a 13-knot crosswind started blowing from the south, threatening to push the aircraft sideways as it landed. If they lost control, they could slide directly into Heathrow's passenger terminals. The safer choice was to land on runway 27 left, where even if they did slide off the pavement, they would end up in open space, instead of crashing into buildings full of people. Inside the cockpit, the workload was overwhelming. Captain Barnby focused on flying. First Officer Morley managed radio calls. Relief Pilot Mayton dug through manuals and kept the cabin crew updated. Air traffic control gave them one complete circle around the airport to buy a few more precious minutes. The cabin crew prepared passengers for an emergency landing and possible evacuation. These were the final controlled moments of the flight. As they lined up with the runway for their final approach, the pilots reviewed their emergency landing checklist one more time. One instruction caught their attention: shut down all engines just before touchdown. The reasoning was obvious. If the engines scraped along the runway, they could cause a devastating fire. But the pilots realized this advice wasn't suitable for their situation. The engines provide hydraulic power that controls the flight controls, like power steering in a car. If they shut down all engines upon landing, they would have almost no control over the aircraft. They would essentially become passengers in their own airplane as it scraped and skidded along the runway. To make this crash landing as survivable as possible, they needed to maintain control for as long as they could, even if it increased the risk of fire. So Captain Barnby made an instant plan. They would touch down on the right main gear on the right side of the runway. As soon as the wheels made contact, Relief Pilot Mayton would shut down engines 1 and 4, the two engines on the outer edges of the wings. These would be the first to hit the ground, and shutting them down would reduce the risk of the plane spinning out of control. By keeping engines 2 and 3 running, the aircraft would still have hydraulic power. This would allow Captain Barnby to control the plane with his side stick and hold the left wing up in the air as long as possible. Only when the aircraft slowed enough that the wing could no longer stay airborne would he shut down the remaining engines. It was a careful, calculated plan designed to balance the risk of fire with the need to maintain control. But whether it would work at speeds of over 130 knots was another question entirely. The crew had essentially become test pilots, and their passengers were unwitting participants in an extreme life and death experiment that had never been tried before in aviation history. Captain Barnby lined up with runway 27 left one final time. Descending through 1,000 feet, the pilots warned the flight attendants and passengers that landing was about to happen. Tension filled the cabin. There was nothing left to do but follow the plan and hope for the best. At just 200 feet above the ground, the pilots gave the order to brace for impact. Flight attendants shouted repeatedly for passengers to put their heads down and grab their ankles, the position that gives people the best chance of surviving a crash. And yes, this was the moment of truth. Captain Barnby kept the plane aligned with the right side of the runway. Behind him, Relief Pilot Mayton prepared to shut down the outer engines the instant they touched down. The right main gear struck the runway with tremendous force. Immediately, Mayton cut engines 1 and 4. Captain Barnby pulled back on his side stick, trying to keep the left wing elevated, but he overdid it slightly. The right outboard engine scraped along the concrete runway, sending a spectacular shower of sparks flying into the air. The passengers gripped their seats as the aircraft shuddered violently, the entire plane shaking under enormous stress. Fire crews raced alongside the half-flying, half-rolling aircraft, chasing it down the runway. As the plane slowed, it became harder and harder for Captain Barnby to keep the left wing off the ground. Physics was working against him. The slower they went, the less lift the wing could generate. He eased back on his controls and ordered the shutdown of the left inboard engine. Mayton complied, and soon both left engines struck the ground, trailing sparks and smoke like a fireworks display. The captain applied the brakes and ordered the shutdown of engine 3. The aircraft began skidding sideways, forcing him to push the right rudder pedal to its absolute limit, desperately trying to keep the plane from sliding off the runway. The sideways skidding put terrible stress on the right main wheels, which was the only landing gear still working properly. Several tires burst under the pressure, but the wheels somehow held. Finally, after what felt like an eternity but lasted only seconds, to everyone's surprise, the aircraft came to a complete stop on the runway. Incredibly and miraculously, everyone on board survived. Not just survived, they escaped without even minor injuries. Within 3 minutes of touchdown, All 114 passengers and crew members had evacuated the aircraft safely. Captain Barnby's improvised landing technique and methodical shutdown of the engines proved so effective that Airbus, the company that built the plane, later adopted it as an official emergency procedure for pilots around the world to learn and practice. The investigation that followed, conducted by the Air Accident Investigation Branch of the UK Department of Transport, praised the crew's handling of the emergency. The investigators found that the landing gear had been jammed by a brake component that had broken loose during takeoff from Los Angeles. It was that tiny torque pin that had fallen onto the beach 10 hours earlier. Amazingly, investigators actually found that pin on the shoreline near Los Angeles International Airport a few days after the dramatic landing at Heathrow. Just imagine now, a piece of metal no bigger than your finger had caused one of the most challenging aviation emergencies ever recorded. The aircraft, registration G-VSKY, was repaired and returned to service. It continued flying for Virgin Atlantic until 2003, then served other airlines before finally being broken up for parts in 2009. Remarkably, Virgin Atlantic faced a similar situation again in 2014 when a Boeing 747 returned to London Gatwick with landing gear problems. But what happened to the flight in the end? That's a story for another video. If you want to know, just comment down below asking for this story. And subscribe to this channel to know about more flight disasters. Also, tell me, after knowing all these, would you feel tense and worried about boarding a flight now? We will meet soon in another video. Until then, fly safe.